Most organizations treat their M365 tenant as a configuration container. It is not your tenant is a sovereign operating system for the enterprise, or it is a vulnerability waiting to scale. The difference between these two states is architectural intent. It is not about tooling, compliance frameworks, or following best practices. It is about intent. In the next 90 minutes, you will learn the 7-step mandate that separates organizations that run Microsoft 365 from those that are run by it. This is not a best practices briefing. This is a deterministic framework for sovereignty. It answers a single question: how do you move from accidental architecture to intentional control? By the end, you will have a mental model for evaluating whether your tenant operates as a system or as a collection of workarounds. The post-SaaS paradox: why your current strategy is scaling entropy. Here is what is happening right now in your Microsoft 365 environment. AI adoption is outpacing data security controls by design, not by accident, and your tenant is not failing because of a simple design omission. It is failing because configuration itself has become invisible. The shift from deterministic workflows to probabilistic AI agents has exposed a fundamental gap where governance frameworks designed for humans do not constrain machines. When Copilot and agentic AI inherit your permissions, they inherit your design omissions at machine speed. Every exception clause in your conditional access policies is an entropy generator that scales with every agent you deploy. Consider what this means operationally. A human admin makes an exception to a policy with the intent that it stays temporary, but 6 months pass and the exception remains. While a human might notice this drift during a quarterly audit, an AI agent executes that exception thousands of times per day without question or hesitation. It has no awareness that the original intent has expired. The cost of this invisibility is no longer theoretical. The average M365 breach now exceeds $4.88 million, and misconfiguration is the leading vector. It is not 0 days or nation-state attacks that do the damage. It is the gap between what you intended to build and what you actually built. This is the post-SaaS paradox. SaaS platforms promised simplicity, but they delivered complexity with a user-friendly interface. Configuration became so easy that organizations stopped thinking about architecture and started thinking about features. They enabled services without designing systems, granted permissions without modeling boundaries, and deployed agents without considering governance. The result is a tenant that appears to work. Uptime metrics are healthy, users are productive, and collaboration tools function exactly as expected. But underneath that surface, entropy is accumulating. Policies drift, permissions sprawl, and agents operate outside the boundaries they were intended to respect. No one knows, because the system is still running. This is worse than a system that fails loudly. A system that fails loudly forces you to fix it, but a system that fails silently scales the failure. Your current strategy assumes that Microsoft's shared responsibility model means Microsoft handles tenant resilience. It does not. Microsoft handles platform resilience while you handle tenant sovereignty. Sovereignty requires architecture, not configuration. Most organizations have not made this distinction. They have treated their tenant as a container they fill with services rather than a system they design. The difference is fundamental. A container can leak and a system can fail, but a system can also be made deterministic and predictable. The mandate begins here. Treat your tenant as a deterministic system that must be explicitly designed, not incrementally configured. Every policy must have intent, every permission must have a boundary, and every state change must be reconcilable. Without this, you are not running a tenant. You are managing a collection of workarounds that happen to function until they do not. The organizations that understand this are already moving. They are implementing privilege identity management as an architectural layer rather than a security feature. They are enforcing tenant isolation as a design principle instead of a restriction. They are adopting configuration as code because it is the only way to maintain sovereignty at scale. The question is not whether you will adopt this framework. The question is whether you will adopt it intentionally or whether entropy will force the adoption upon you through incident, breach, or audit failure. Defining sovereignty, what it means to own your tenant. Sovereignty is not the same thing as autonomy, and that distinction matters because the two concepts represent entirely different operational states. Autonomy is just the ability to act without someone stopping you, but sovereignty is something much more valuable. It is predictability. In a sovereign tenant, every decision is traceable, every permission has a hard boundary, and every change to the system state can be reconciled against your original intent. Most organizations today operate in a state of accidental architecture where they have built systems that technically work, but they have no idea why they work. Because they cannot predict what happens when a single variable changes, they aren't actually practicing governance. They are relying on luck, and the problem with luck is that it eventually fails when you try to scale it. True sovereignty means you can answer 3 specific questions with absolute certainty. First, you must know exactly who has access to what data and why they have it. This cannot be an approximation or a guess based on a project from 6 months ago. It must be a factual reality right now. Second, you need to know exactly what will happen if a specific policy changes. You should be able to model the blast radius and see the cascading dependencies before you click save. Third, you must have a way to detect and fix configuration drift immediately. This doesn't happen through quarterly audits, but through continuous reconciliation where drift is caught in minutes and fixed by a machine or a deliberate human choice. If you lack this level of sovereignty, you aren't actually running a tenant. You are just managing a collection of temporary workarounds that have slowly calcified into permanent infrastructure. When sovereignty works operationally, every policy follows a strict life cycle where the intent is documented and the scope is clearly defined. The configuration is version controlled and deployed through a formal change process while being monitored every second of the day. If the system drifts from that known good state, an alert fires within minutes so the remediation can be automated or approved by an authorized human. 6 months down the line, if someone asks why a policy exists, you don't have to go find the person who created it. You simply read the configuration history because the entire lifecycle is fully auditable. This is not a theoretical exercise for architects. Organizations that operate this way see measurably better security and faster incident response times because they have lower friction during compliance audits. They suffer from fewer breaches caused by simple misconfigurations, not because their admins are more careful, but because they made that carefulness an automatic part of the architecture. They embedded their intent directly into the system design. The mandate is simple. You must treat your tenant as a deterministic system that is explicitly designed rather than one that is incrementally configured. In practice, this means every role assignment is time-bound and standing privileges are treated as a rare failure of design. Access becomes just in time, every exception is tracked as a temporary state, and every configuration change is version controlled. When every state in the system is observable, you are no longer guessing about your security posture. Building this requires a real investment in tooling and a fundamental shift in how your organization views cloud infrastructure. The alternative is a tenant that looks functional on the surface but is actually incredibly fragile underneath. It is a system where one small mistake can cascade into a massive breach, or where a single agent operating outside its boundaries can exfiltrate your data. In that world, every forgotten policy exception becomes a permanent vulnerability that stays open forever. Organizations that make this shift find that their operational burden actually decreases even as their control over the environment increases. They stop fighting entropy manually because they have made that entropy visible and measurable. By making detection and remediation automatic, what used to look like management overhead turns into architectural efficiency. Sovereignty is a continuous practice rather than a final destination, but once you establish it, the process becomes self-reinforcing. Every layer of automation you add reduces the space for human error, and every version-controlled policy reduces the mental load on your operators. As these automated loops reduce the time between detection and a fix, the system becomes more resilient. You have to ask yourself if your tenant is sovereign or if it is just accidental. If you cannot answer those 3 core questions with certainty, you already know the answer, and you know exactly what needs to change. Layer 1. Identity as the distributed decision engine. Identity is no longer just an authentication service, and that is the first mental shift you have to make when looking at your tenant. Identity has become the control plane for every single decision your organization makes. Microsoft Entra ID is not a directory, it is a distributed decision engine where every sign-in and every token issuance represents a critical decision point. Each of those points is an opportunity to either enforce sovereignty or allow entropy to take hold. Most organizations still treat Entra like a digital filing cabinet where they sync users from on-premises and assign a few roles. They move on once the accounts are created, but that isn't using identity as a control plane. The mandate for a sovereign tenant requires a completely different posture. You need to stop viewing conditional access as a security feature and start treating it as your primary architecture. This isn't just a word game, it is a structural reality that changes the questions you ask during design. Instead of asking if you should require MFA, you should be asking what your authentication architecture actually looks like. You stop trying to block risky sign-ins and start designing sign-in logic that is deterministic and fully auditable. The operational reality is that overprivileged roles cause 60% of identity-based breaches, yet many organizations still let admins use global admin for daily work. This is not a failure of training, but a failure of architecture. If your system design allows standing global admin access to exist, then your architecture is broken. The people aren't the problem, the design is. Deterministic identity means that every role is time-bound and standing privileges are eliminated entirely. You use privileged identity management to ensure access is granted just in time, which makes every decision logged and every exception temporary. When a role assignment is set to expire, the system enforces that expiration automatically. Exceptions don't persist because someone forgot to delete them. They vanish because the system is designed to remove them. Ignoring this layer has an immediate and expensive cost as your tenant turns into a permission sprawl machine. Every new agent you deploy inherits that mess, and every user with a temporary role that becomes permanent adds more entropy to the environment. Because identity decisions happen at machine speed, this sprawl scales much faster than any human team can audit. The real-world impact of these decisions is easy to see. Organizations that strictly enforce privileged identity management see policy optimization happen 43% faster than those that don't. They also experience much more accurate anomaly detection because their Entra AI agents aren't trying to filter through the noise of standing privileges. These are structural improvements that dictate how fast your system can respond to a real threat. The mandate for this layer is very specific. You must implement PIM for every role above your baseline. All standing privileges must become time-bound, and you need to deploy conditional access baselines that block legacy auth while requiring device compliance for privileged roles. You also need a role governance committee because this isn't an optional layer of red tape. IT, security, and the business must own these role decisions together so that individual admins aren't making architectural choices in a vacuum. You have to measure the things that actually matter, like the percentage of roles under PIM or your external identity exposure index. These numbers tell you if your identity layer is deterministic or if it has become accidental. If you cannot measure the state of your identities, you cannot govern them, and entropy will continue to pile up. Moving from standing privileges to just-in-time access will feel like friction to your team at first. Admins have to request access and wait for approvals, which feels slower than just having the permissions ready to go. However, this is actually a faster way to work because it eliminates the need for manual audits and stops the accumulation of dangerous exceptions. It kills the drift that happens when privileges live longer than the projects they were meant for. When you treat identity as a distributed decision engine, every access choice is made through policy instead of through exceptions. Every policy becomes auditable, every exception stays temporary, and every change in state is reconcilable. This is what deterministic identity looks like, and it is the first essential layer of a sovereign tenant. Layer 2, tenant isolation and boundary enforcement. Boundaries are not restrictions. This is the second fundamental shift in your thinking. Architecturally, boundaries are the lines that separate what is inside your control from everything that sits outside. They function as the barriers that prevent lateral movement and the enforcement mechanisms that keep data from flowing where it was never intended to go. February 1st, 2026 served as a watershed moment for the ecosystem. Microsoft enforced Power Platform tenant isolation by default, which blocked all cross-tenant connections unless an admin explicitly configured them. Organizations that failed to pre-configure their allow lists lost their cross-tenant integrations overnight, but this was not a bug. This was architecture becoming mandatory. Microsoft decided the default state of the cloud should be secure rather than permissive, forcing organizations that relied on open defaults to either adapt or break. This enforcement teaches a specific lesson about system design. Boundary control is not about restricting collaboration, but rather about making every data flow explicit and auditable. When cross-tenant connections are blocked by default, you are forced to ask why a connection needs to exist and what business justification actually supports it. You have to identify who owns the connection and how the security team will monitor it. These are not security theater questions. They are architectural requirements that force you to understand your own infrastructure. Boundary enforcement operates at 3 distinct levels, and all 3 are required for a deterministic model. First, you have logical isolation through Entra ID authorization and role-based access control. Second, you have storage-level isolation through encryption and subscription boundaries. Third, you have cross-tenant policy enforcement through explicit allow lists instead of implicit trust. A system relying only on logical isolation remains vulnerable to a single misconfiguration, while a system with all 3 layers becomes deterministic. The cost of permissive defaults is easily measurable in technical debt. You see it in data exfiltration via Power Platform connectors and shadow automation crossing tenant boundaries without any audit trail. External identities operate with overprivileged access because no one explicitly scoped their permissions, and lateral movement becomes trivial during breach scenarios because tenants were assumed to be trusted. Organizations that implement strict tenant isolation see a 40% reduction in lateral movement risk during a breach. This does not happen because those organizations are more paranoid, but because they have made lateral movement architecturally difficult for an attacker. If a breach occurs in one tenant, the infection cannot automatically spread to another because the attacker must cross an explicit monitored boundary. That boundary is logged and guarded, which is exactly what makes the breach detectable before it scales. The mandate for this layer is operational and specific. You must use universal tenant restrictions enforced at the cloud edge via global secure access. This is not optional infrastructure, it is foundational to the stack. Every access attempt from outside your tenant boundary must go through this gate, and every outbound request from your tenant is subject to this policy. This does not happen through an exception process, but through the architecture itself. You need to audit every cross-tenant connection in Power Platform, SharePoint, and Teams while documenting the business justification for each one. You will likely find that 60% or more of your cross-tenant connections have no documented business case at all. They are legacy artifacts and forgotten experiments that now function as technical debt, masquerading as functionality. Decommission them immediately. For the connections that remain, implement explicit allow lists using specific tenant IDs rather than wildcards. You will find that most of what you thought was necessary is actually just noise. Implement data loss prevention policies for sensitive data classes like PII, financial records, and intellectual property. These policies should be tested in report-only mode before you move to enforcement, so you can understand exactly what they catch and what they miss. DLP is not about preventing all data movement, but about making that movement visible and auditable to the administrators. Measure the metrics that actually define the health of this layer. Track the percentage of cross-tenant connections that are explicitly allowed and the percentage of data flows that are fully auditable. Ask yourself if you can isolate a compromised tenant and prevent the spread of an attack right now. If you cannot answer that question with certainty, your boundaries are not deterministic. The shift from implicit trust to explicit verification often feels like operational overhead to a traditional team. It is not. It is the elimination of the flawed assumption that all tenants are inherently trustworthy. Once you stop making that assumption, you stop building systems that fail the moment a boundary is violated. You build systems that work because the assumption no longer matters. Boundary enforcement is the second layer of sovereignty, and without it, your identity controls are effectively meaningless. Layer 3. Configuration as code and deterministic reconciliation. Configuration drift is not a monitoring problem. I want to be direct about this because the distinction determines whether your sovereignty is real or just an illusion. Configuration drift is an architectural failure. If your security baseline is configured once and then left to drift over time, you no longer have a baseline. You have a memory, and in complex systems, memory always fails. Most organizations approach configuration through a cycle of decay. A security team designs a baseline and implements it, but then months pass and business units begin requesting exceptions. These exceptions accumulate without being tracked systematically until a quarterly audit discovers months of accumulated drift. Manual fixes follow, but new drift is reintroduced during that remediation because the process itself is manual and prone to human error. This is not governance. This is reactive firefighting disguised as a policy. The mandate here is absolute. Microsoft 365 desired state configuration or an equivalent framework must be your only source of truth. Your source of truth cannot be your memory, your documentation, or a quarterly audit checklist. It must be code. Code is version controlled, code is auditable, and most importantly, code is reproducible across any environment. Deterministic reconciliation changes how you handle the environment in practice. Every configuration change becomes version controlled, so you can see who changed a setting, when they did it, and why it happened. You gain the ability to revert to any previous state, and drift is detected within minutes rather than months. An automated system continuously compares your actual state to your desired state, and when they diverge, an alert fires immediately. Remediation is either automated or gated by an explicit human decision, meaning you never wait for an audit to discover that your security has eroded. The alternative is the configure and forget model that most organizations use today. They audit every 90 days and discover 6 months of drift, which they then try to fix manually. Those manual fixes almost always introduce new drift, and the cycle repeats indefinitely. This is not a security posture, it is just entropy management through brute force. The impact of moving to a code-based model is significant. Organizations using DSC-based frameworks detect policy deviations in under 5 minutes, and remediation typically happens in under 10. This does not require heroic effort from your staff because the automation handles the heavy lifting. The system detects the drift and fixes it, while humans are only notified to approve high-risk changes. Configuration entropy is the hidden tax you pay for scaling a cloud environment. Every Teams instance you create spawns a SharePoint site, a mailbox, and an M365 group. Without lifecycle governance, you are not scaling a business. You are just scaling sprawl. Every site has permissions, every permission has exceptions, and every exception has a reason that made sense 6 months ago but is now forgotten. Every one of those forgotten reasons is technical debt that an attacker can use. This mandate must extend to the entire lifecycle of the resource. Permanent resources should be rare, and most should have expiration policies enforced the moment they are created. A team site created for a specific project should expire automatically when that project ends. A guest user invited for a temporary purpose should have access that expires by policy, not through a manual review that might never happen. Even an exception granted for a temporary business need must have a hard expiration date tracked by the system. This requires an investment in tooling and a serious shift in discipline. You are moving from configuration management to true configuration governance. The payoff is that your cognitive load decreases because you are no longer manually tracking every deviation. Your security posture improves because drift is no longer allowed to accumulate unchecked in the dark corners of your tenant. You should implement Microsoft 365 DSC to establish a baseline configuration for all your tenants. Document every setting and policy within the code itself, and implement automated drift detection that runs every 4 hours. Every configuration change must be version controlled and tested before it ever touches your production environment. Measure your mean time to detect drift and aim for a target of under 5 minutes. Track your mean time to remediate those deviations and ensure that 100% of your changes are approved before deployment. These metrics will tell you whether your configuration is deterministic or merely accidental. Configuration as code is not a best practice for the highly motivated. It is the only way to maintain sovereignty at scale. Without it, you are just managing drift manually and losing the battle against entropy. With it, your drift becomes visible, measurable, and automatic to fix. This is the third layer of sovereignty, and without it, your identity and boundary controls will eventually be undermined by a configuration that drifted away from your intent. Layer 4, tenant classification and lifecycle governance. Shadow tenants have become the new shadow IT, and organizations are quietly accumulating production, test legacy, and ephemeral environments without any systematic plan to decommission them. This is the uncomfortable truth. Every unmanaged tenant acts as a potential pivot point for lateral movement and a constant source of compliance violations. These environments are not just sitting idle, they are actively increasing your governance overhead and expanding your attack surface. Most organizations cannot answer the simple question of how many tenants they actually operate, though they usually suspect the real number is much higher than their official records suggest. The architectural mandate is to classify every single tenant by its specific purpose and then apply differentiated controls based on that classification. Production tenants are permanent because they run critical business workloads, which means they require the most rigorous security baselines and continuous monitoring. Productivity tenants are semi-permanent environments that support departmental operations, so while they still need strong baselines, their monitoring intensity is slightly lower than production. Auxiliary tenants are temporary setups for specific initiatives or integrations requiring standard baselines but operating within strictly defined expiration windows. Finally, ephemeral tenants are explicitly temporary, created for short-term projects or proofs of concept, and they must expire automatically without any exceptions. This classification system is not just administrative overhead, it is a form of architectural clarity that allows you to apply governance proportional to actual risk. Once you define what a tenant is for, a production environment gets the full suite of controls, while an ephemeral one receives baseline security and a self-destruct timer. Legacy tenants are reviewed every quarter to see if a business justification still exists, and if that justification has vanished, the environment is decommissioned immediately. Lifecycle governance means that decommissioning is a deterministic outcome rather than a manual suggestion. For ephemeral tenants, a timer starts the moment they are created, and when that timer hits 0, the tenant is removed from the operating environment. Auxiliary tenants face a quarterly review process where the lack of a clear business case leads to immediate retirement. You must understand that decommissioning is final, whereas archiving is just another form of technical debt that keeps a ghost environment alive. While you can preserve data if the law requires it, the tenant itself must be purged to stop the accumulation of architectural erosion. The cost of tenant sprawl is measurable in both risk and resources. Every unmanaged tenant increases your audit scope and provides a fresh path for an attacker to move through your infrastructure. Organizations that implement strict tenant classification usually see a 30% reduction in unmanaged environments within the first 90 days of the program. This success does not happen because the admins became more diligent. It happens because they made the sprawl visible and used automation to remediate it. This same mandate applies to teams, groups, and sites, where default creation should be restricted to prevent the platform from becoming a junk drawer. Governance must be built into the provisioning process rather than being bolted on as an afterthought once the environment is already messy. When a user creates a team, the system should automatically enforce naming conventions and ownership requirements through a creation policy. Groups should have expiration dates set at the moment of birth, and every new site should be forced into a hub association based on its purpose. Consider a Fortune 500 company that discovered 2,000 inactive teams after they finally implemented lifecycle policies. By decommissioning those abandoned groups, they reduced their compliance audit scope by 40% almost overnight. Those teams were not necessarily breached, but they were a massive governance liability that required constant oversight for no business gain. The company shifted from managing a chaotic mess to a smaller, active set of assets, which decreased their operational burden while simultaneously improving their security posture. You need to implement tenant classification immediately by documenting the business justification for every environment you currently own. You will likely find that 20% of your tenants are legacy or abandoned assets that should have been deleted years ago. Move toward a model where new tenants can only be created with explicit approval and a documented business case that includes an end date. Ephemeral tenants must auto-expire, auxiliary tenants must be reviewed every 90 days, and only production environments should be treated as permanent. Extend this lifecycle governance to your teams and SharePoint sites by restricting creation rights to authorized users and enforcing policies at the point of provisioning. You should measure your progress by tracking the percentage of classified tenants, with a hard target of 100%. Your shadow tenant discovery rate should be 0, and your lifecycle compliance should stay above 95% to ensure the system remains healthy. Tenant classification and lifecycle governance represent the fourth layer of sovereignty. Without these controls, sprawl will continue to accumulate until the environment becomes unmanageable. With them, your ecosystem stays lean, and your governance efforts remain proportional to the actual risks you face. This is the layer that stops the chaos before it has a chance to start. Layer 5. Agent identity and agentic governance. By the year 2028, researchers forecast that over 1 billion AI agents will be active in the global workforce. Your organization will eventually host hundreds or even thousands of these entities, which is not a speculative guess, but a clear architectural trajectory. This shift demands a fifth layer of sovereignty that most organizations have not even begun to build. You must understand that agents are not applications, and failing to make that distinction is a foundational mistake. An application is a static tool that a human user operates, but an agent is an autonomous entity with its own persistent identity and delegated permissions. Agents make independent decisions, execute complex workflows, and operate without a human in the loop to double-check their actions. Because they behave like employees rather than software, they require a fundamentally different approach to governance and oversight. The mandate for this layer is to treat Agent 365 as your primary control plane. This system treats agents as first-class principals, giving them unique identities that are always tied back to a specific human sponsor. This is not an optional feature for companies experimenting with AI. It is the foundational governance required to deploy these tools at scale. In a practical sense, agent governance means every autonomous entity has a registered Entra-Agent ID and a human who is legally and operationally responsible for its behavior. Every agent must operate under the principle of least privilege, meaning its access is scoped to specific data rather than the entire tenant. Every action an agent takes must be logged in a way that is easily auditable, so you can reconstruct its decision-making process if something goes wrong. When an agent is created, it must enter a centralized registry that serves as the only source of truth for what is actually running in your environment. The biggest pitfall here is agent sprawl, which happens when business teams deploy AI tools outside of IT oversight because it feels faster or less bureaucratic. This is the same impulse that drove the shadow IT explosion, and it happens because the official governance path is often too slow for the speed of the business. Organizations that use Agent 365 see a 60% reduction in unmanaged agents because they make the governed path the easiest way to get work done. This mandate also extends to Microsoft Copilot, which is itself a powerful agent that can scale your existing tenant chaos at machine speed. A Copilot instance that has access to all your corporate data is not necessarily more useful, but it is significantly more dangerous. The difference between a powerful tool and a massive security risk is architectural, and it depends entirely on whether you have scoped its access to specific relevant data sources. The impact of this control is easy to see in the real world. One financial services firm discovered they had 300 unmanaged Copilot instances accessing sensitive data without any oversight. By implementing Agent 365 governance, they reduced that number to 12 sanctioned and scoped instances within just 60 days. They did not lose any actual capability during this transition, but they gained total visibility into what their AI was doing. The 12 governed instances were actually more effective than the original 300 because they were aligned with specific business purposes rather than being random noise. You should implement Agent 365 as your centralized registry today and begin discovering every Power Automate bot and custom AI agent in your system. Assign each one a unique Entra-Agent ID and require a human sponsor who is personally accountable for the agent's actions. This sponsor is not the developer who wrote the code, but the business lead who authorized the agent to act on their behalf. Permissions for these agents must be scoped so that no entity has broad tenant-wide access to your information. If you have a Copilot instance designed to summarize emails, it should have read access to the inbox but no permission to delete or send messages. A Power Automate agent that manages tasks should be able to create items in Planner without having the rights to modify or delete existing tasks. Finally, you must implement continuous agent monitoring that logs every action and alerts your team the moment it sees anomalous behavior. You need established playbooks for suspending or decommissioning an agent if it starts acting outside its intended scope. This detection should not happen during a quarterly audit. It should happen through automated policies that can freeze an agent in real time. Measure your success by tracking the percentage of agents in your registry and ensuring that every single one has a verified human sponsor. When 100% of agent actions are logged and auditable, you will know that your AI ecosystem is sovereign rather than accidental. Agent identity is the final layer of sovereignty that prevents these new tools from becoming a fresh vector for sprawl and risk. Layer 6. Deterministic operations and zero-fault O&M. Most organizations treat incident response as a test of human heroism, but that is a fundamental architectural failure. Deterministic operations is a framework that shifts your entire organization away from reactive firefighting and toward a model of proactive fault prevention and automated remediation. This approach, pioneered by Huawei Cloud and adopted by leading enterprises, carries a very specific mandate. You must stop managing incidents and start preventing them through design rather than hope. The uncomfortable truth is that most organizations operate in a permanent reactive posture where something breaks, an alert fires, and a team rushes to respond. After the incident is resolved and the post-mortem is filed, the lessons are documented only for the entire cycle to repeat itself indefinitely. That is not operations, it is simply firefighting. Deterministic operations inverts this model by ensuring faults are prevented through architecture, and when prevention fails, detection is immediate and remediation is entirely automated. In this world, human involvement is the rare exception rather than the default setting. To reach this state, you must implement the 4 pillars of deterministic O&M, starting with a quality culture that prioritizes organizational accountability over individual competence. Every single component must have a clear owner who is responsible for ensuring that the component does not break in the first place. The second pillar is high availability architecture, where systems are designed to meet strict service level objectives rather than vague uptime goals. Third, you must maintain dynamic risk governance by keeping a live fault library and running regular drills to test your recovery procedures against continuous change. Finally, you must deploy intelligent O&M tools that detect faults and remediate known patterns without needing a manual escalation. When you move to this model, the outcome becomes measurable because 80% of cloud faults are resolved in under 10 minutes without any human intervention. This is not achieved through heroic effort, but through a system that detects a fault, applies the pre-approved remediation, and simply notifies a human of the result. The loop is measured in minutes rather than hours, which fundamentally changes the stability of the platform. In a Microsoft 365 context, this means automated health checks are watching your environment continuously rather than running on a static schedule. When a threshold is crossed, detection is instantaneous, and the system triggers playbooks for critical fixes that have already been pre-tested and versioned. You are no longer waiting for the smartest person in the room to figure out what happened because your architecture makes the failure obvious and your playbooks make the fix clear. Low-risk fixes happen automatically, while high-risk actions use humans as a gate rather than the entire engine of remediation. Organizations that commit to deterministic O&M typically see a 40% reduction in their mean time to resolution and a 60% drop in manual effort. They achieve these results not because their staff is more skilled, but because they have eliminated the need for human skill to be the limiting factor. The system becomes deterministic, the response becomes predictable, and the outcome remains consistent regardless of who is on call. This mandate requires a front-loaded investment in tooling and process, meaning you must build playbooks, establish SLOs, and track fault patterns religiously. You have to measure whether you are meeting those objectives and update your playbooks every time a new pattern emerges in the environment. While this requires significant initial work, the long-term operational burden decreases as the system begins to manage its own stability. You should start by defining ownership for every architectural layer and assigning accountability for drift, incidents, and remediation. Every critical service needs defined RTO and RPO targets, and you must test your failover scenarios at least once a quarter to ensure they actually work. By maintaining a fault library and automating your health checks, you ensure that escalation becomes a rare event rather than a daily routine. Ultimately, you must measure what matters by targeting a mean time to detect faults of under 5 minutes and a remediation time of under 10. If 80% of your faults are not being resolved without escalation, your operations are still reactive rather than deterministic. This is the 6th layer of sovereignty, and without it, even the most sound architecture remains operationally fragile and unsustainable. Layer 7. Continuous sovereignty assessment and architectural oversight. Sovereignty is not a static state you achieve. It is a continuous practice that requires constant vigilance against the forces of entropy. You can implement the first 6 layers perfectly, but over time, the system will inevitably drift as your organization grows and adds new workloads. This drift does not happen because of failure, but because of the natural complexity that comes with success. Without a final layer of continuous assessment, that complexity slowly transforms into architectural entropy that erodes your control. The mandate for this final layer is absolute. You must implement a sovereignty audit framework that measures the health of all 6 previous layers. This is not a standard compliance checklist, but rather an architectural health dashboard that tells you whether your tenant remains sovereign or is slipping into chaos. It provides the visibility you need to see where your policies are failing before those failures become security incidents. Your audit scorecard must measure 6 specific dimensions, starting with identity governance to see what percentage of privileged roles are actually under PIM enforcement. You need to track your external identity exposure and monitor your boundaries to see how many cross-tenant connections are explicitly allowed. For configuration, you should measure the mean time to detect drift and how long it takes to remediate a deviation from your version-controlled policies. Lifecycle metrics must track shadow tenant discovery, while agent metrics ensure every automated entity has a human sponsor and a logged audit trail. Finally, your operational metrics will confirm whether your mean time to remediate faults is actually hitting your deterministic targets. These are not theoretical or abstract measurements. They are the operational pulse of your environment that proves whether your governance is real or illusory. If you cannot measure these dimensions, you cannot govern them, and entropy will eventually overwhelm your original design. By making governance visible, organizations typically see a 25% improvement in their maturity within the first 6 months. This mandate extends all the way to executive accountability, where boards should be reviewing this sovereignty scorecard as a strategic metric rather than a technical artifact. There is a fundamental distinction between running Microsoft 365 and being run by it, and the board needs to know which side of that line the company sits on. When sovereignty is treated as a strategic measure, it ensures that the resources needed for maintenance are always available. To implement this framework, you should establish a dashboard that tracks all 6 dimensions and conduct formal reviews with executive leadership every quarter. You must identify the gaps, prioritize the necessary improvements, and commit to raising the score of your weakest layer by at least 10% each period. This is not about a one-time heroic effort, but about a systematic cycle of improvement that keeps the architecture aligned with your original intent. The final layer is ultimately about visibility, because once you can see the true state of your tenant, you can make informed decisions about how to protect it. Operating without this visibility means you are merely hoping your governance is working, which is a dangerous way to manage an enterprise environment. Continuous assessment is the layer that makes all other layers accountable, turning a collection of isolated practices into a single integrated system. When you reach layer 7, your sovereignty is no longer a set of rules, but a managed system that improves itself over time. It provides the oversight necessary to ensure that your identity controls, boundaries, and automated operations do not degrade as the organization evolves. This is the final piece of the puzzle that ensures your digital sovereignty remains sustainable for the long haul. The implementation mandate, Phase 1, Identity Foundation, 0 to 90 days. Attempting to implement all 7 layers of this architecture simultaneously is a recipe for failure because entropy will simply overwhelm your team. Your organization lacks the capacity to redesign identity, enforce boundaries, and adopt configuration as code while simultaneously governing life cycles and measuring sovereignty. The mandate must be phased, where each stage builds upon the previous one to deliver measurable value within a specific time frame before the next begins. Phase 1 focuses entirely on identity as your foundation, which is necessary because every other layer depends on this one being deterministic. You cannot enforce meaningful boundaries if your identity landscape is chaotic, nor can you govern configurations if you lack certainty regarding who is actually making changes. Identity comes first because without knowing exactly who your agents are, you cannot hope to scope their power. The mandate for these first 90 days is specific and achievable, starting with a full inventory of every privileged role in the environment. You need to look at global admins, Exchange, SharePoint, and Teams admins, along with security and compliance roles, to count exactly how many people hold elevated access. You will likely find that 50% or more of your accounts are overprivileged, which is a universal reality rather than an unusual mistake. Organizations grant roles for specific projects that eventually end, yet the roles persist because the manual removal process is prone to error and often ignored. Second, you must implement privileged identity management for every role above your baseline, and this is a foundational requirement rather than an optional feature. When PIM is active, standing privileges effectively end, meaning a user who needs global admin access must explicitly request it. That request goes to an approver who reviews the need and grants access for a limited window, usually 4 hours before the permission automatically expires. This creates intentional friction that prevents standing privileges from accumulating over time, as the user cannot simply renew the access themselves without a fresh request. Third, you need to deploy your conditional access baselines to block legacy authentication and require MFA for every single user. These are not optional hardening measures, but rather architectural requirements, especially since legacy protocols like POP3 and IMAP cannot support modern multi-factor authentication. If you allow these protocols to exist, you are allowing access that cannot be protected, so you must block them and ensure every user authenticates with MFA. Furthermore, privilege roles should only be accessible from compliant devices that meet your security baseline, such as having encryption and firewalls enabled. If a user tries to access a sensitive role from a non-compliant device, the system should block them immediately rather than just issuing a warning. Fourth, you must establish a role governance committee that owns these access decisions instead of leaving them to individual admins or business units. This committee should include representatives from IT, security, and the business side to review, document, and approve or deny every role request that comes through. They must also review role assignments every quarter, and if a specific assignment no longer has a valid business justification, the committee removes it. To know if Phase 1 is working, you must measure the percentage of privileged roles under PIM and the percentage of accounts under conditional access with a target of 100% for both. You should also track the anomaly detection accuracy of your Entra AI agents to ensure it stays above 90%. These metrics are the only way to prove whether your identity layer has actually become deterministic. In a real-world scenario, a mid-market organization with 5,000 users managed to complete this phase in just 60 days. They discovered 200 overprivileged accounts and successfully reduced them to 12 scoped roles while implementing PM for all elevated access. By the end of that 2-month period, their identity layer was deterministic, meaning every access decision was policy-driven and every exception was temporary and auditable. Phase 1 is about establishing foundational control rather than solving every single identity problem your organization faces. You are solving the most critical issue, which is standing privilege. And once every access decision is driven by policy, your foundation becomes solid. Everything that follows in this architecture depends on this layer being stable. Do not skip this phase or try to accelerate it, and never assume your organization is already doing this correctly. Most organizations still have global admins using their high-level access for daily tasks and roles that persist years after the original project died. Phase 1 fixes these structural flaws in 90 days, providing the measurable value you need to move into Phase 2. The implementation mandate. Phase 2, boundary enforcement, 90 to 180 days. Phase 2 shifts the focus toward tenant isolation and data boundary enforcement, which is the stage where you finally begin to manage external risk. Now that your identity layer is deterministic and your privileges are time-bound, you must ensure the data those identities touch is properly bounded. You are moving toward a model where data movement is always explicit and every flow across the environment is fully auditable. This phase runs from day 90 to day 180, and it relies entirely on the identity foundation you built during the first 3 months. If you attempt to enforce boundaries without first controlling identity, the project will fail because boundary enforcement without identity control is architecturally meaningless. These two layers must work together to create a complete security posture. The mandate for Phase 2 is highly operational, beginning with an audit of every cross-tenant connection in Power Platform, SharePoint, and Teams. You must document the business justification for every single connection, and you will likely discover that most of them have no documented case at all. These are usually legacy integrations or forgotten pilots, representing technical debt that is simply masquerading as useful functionality. If you cannot justify a connection, you must decommission it. Second, you must implement universal tenant restrictions through global secure access as a foundational piece of your infrastructure. Every access attempt from outside your tenant boundary must go through this gate, and every outbound flow from your tenant must be subject to this policy. This is not a matter of making exceptions, it is an architectural requirement where the system evaluates every request against an allow list. If a tenant isn't on that list, access is denied, making the entire process deterministic and auditable. Third, you need to configure explicit allow lists for legitimate cross-tenant flows using specific tenant IDs rather than dangerous wildcards. Using a wildcard defeats the entire purpose of boundary enforcement because allow all is not a boundary, it is a total lack of control. Be specific, document why each tenant is allowed, and review these lists every quarter to remove any entries where the business need has expired. Fourth, you must implement data loss prevention policies for sensitive data classes like PII, financial records, and intellectual property. You should test these policies in report-only mode first to understand exactly what they catch and what they might miss before you turn on full enforcement. DLP is not intended to stop all data movement, but rather to make that movement visible so that when sensitive information leaves the organization, the system logs the event and blocks or warns the user based on your policy. For Phase 2, you should measure the percentage of cross-tenant connections that are explicitly allowed and the percentage of data flows that are auditable, aiming for 100% on both. You also need to track your breach containment time with a target of staying under 4 hours. If you cannot say with certainty that you can isolate a compromised tenant to prevent a spread, then your boundaries are not yet deterministic. The impact of this phase is often eye-opening, as seen with a financial services firm that discovered 300 undocumented cross-tenant flows during their implementation. They were able to decommission 240 of those flows within 90 days because they were created by business teams without any IT oversight. Once phase 2 was finished, those hidden risks were gone, and the organization finally had the visibility and control they had been missing. Phase 2 is designed to make data movement explicit because most organizations will find that 40% of their connections serve no current business purpose. Those connections are nothing more than compliance liabilities and expanded attack surfaces that need to be removed. By scoping the remaining connections and implementing DLP, you create a boundary enforcement model that is truly deterministic. Do not skip these steps or assume your current connections are justified, because most organizations cannot actually answer these questions when pressed. Phase 2 forces you to confront these realities over the course of 90 days. Completing this work delivers immediate value and prepares the environment for Phase 3, where you will manage internal entropy through configuration determinism. The implementation mandate, Phase 3, configuration determinism. Phase 3 shifts the focus to configuration as code and deterministic reconciliation, which is the only way to truly manage internal entropy. You have already finished the first 2 phases, meaning your identity layer is deterministic and your boundaries are strictly enforced. Now you must ensure the configurations governing those layers do not drift by making the configuration itself deterministic. This phase runs from day 180 to day 270 and builds directly on the control you established earlier. If you attempt to jump into phase 3 without completing the previous steps, you will fail. Configuration determinism is meaningless without identity control. It is incomplete without boundary enforcement, and without a solid foundation, it is simply impossible to achieve. The mandate for this phase is architectural and uncompromising, starting with the selection of a configuration management framework like Microsoft 365, desired state configuration, or Microsoft Graph. Do not attempt to manage these settings through the UI because that interface is designed for humans, while configuration management is for systems. When you click through the UI, you are managing things manually, and while manual management scales linearly, automated management scales logarithmically. That difference is exponential. Next, you must establish a baseline configuration for every tenant by documenting every setting, policy, and exception. This baseline is your only source of truth, and it cannot live in your memory or in static documentation. Your source of truth is code because code is version-controlled, auditable, and easily reproduced. When you need to verify a baseline, you don't ask a person for their opinion. You read the code. If you need to know who changed a setting, you check the version history, and if you need to revert a mistake, you simply execute a command. Third, you need to implement automated drift detection that runs reconciliation checks every 4 hours. A system must continuously compare your actual environment to your desired configuration so that when they diverge, an alert fires immediately. This allows you to detect drift in minutes rather than months, moving away from quarterly audits toward a model of continuous monitoring. The system is always watching, and the moment a setting changes, the system knows. Fourth, you must establish a formal change approval process where every modification is version controlled, tested, and approved before it ever hits production. When an admin wants to change a policy, they modify the configuration code and submit it for a peer review. The reviewer examines the change to understand the intent and the impact before approving it for testing in a non-production environment. If those tests succeed, the change is deployed, creating a trail that is fully auditable. 6 months from now, if someone asks why a policy exists, you can point to the specific request, the person who proposed it, and the exact date it was deployed. You must measure what matters during this phase, specifically targeting a mean time to detect drift of under 5 minutes. Your goal for remediating those deviations should be under 10 minutes, and 100% of your changes must be approved before deployment. These metrics are the only way to prove that your configuration has actually become deterministic. A real-world scenario validates why this matters, such as an enterprise with 50 tenants that discovered 15 of them had drifted significantly from the baseline. They found disabled conditional access policies, relaxed MFA requirements, and temporary DLP exceptions that had quietly become permanent. The automated reconciliation system corrected these issues within 24 hours without a single manual fix. The system detected the drift and applied the remediation while humans were notified of the results, proving that the loop is measured in hours rather than weeks. Configuration entropy is the hidden cost of operating at scale, where every new Teams instance creates a SharePoint site, a mailbox, and a group. Every one of those sites has permissions, and every permission eventually gains an exception for a reason that made sense months ago but is now forgotten. Without deterministic reconciliation, these exceptions pile up until the system is unmanageable, but with it, they become visible and eventually expire. This mandate extends to the entire resource lifecycle, meaning permanent resources should be extremely rare. Most resources should have expiration policies enforced the moment they are created, such as a project-based team site or a guest user invited for a specific task. An exception granted for a temporary business need must expire through policy rather than manual tracking. The system enforces these timelines because the system is deterministic. Phase 3 is about solving the most critical problem in your environment: configuration drift. Once drift is eliminated and every change is version controlled and remediated automatically, your configuration layer finally becomes a solid foundation. Everything that follows in your architecture depends on this stability. Do not skip this phase, as it takes 90 days and delivers immediate measurable value to the organization. It prepares you for Phase 4, where you will finally prevent sprawl through aggressive lifecycle governance. The implementation mandate. Phase 4. Lifecycle governance, 270 to 360 days. Phase 4 focuses on tenant classification and lifecycle governance to stop sprawl at the very source. You have already secured your identity layer, enforced your boundaries, and put your configuration under version control. Now you must ensure that resources do not proliferate without oversight by making sprawl architecturally difficult to achieve. This phase runs from day 270 to day 360 and relies entirely on the work you did in the previous months. If you try to implement lifecycle governance without identity control or configuration determinism, the process will be meaningless and unsustainable. With that foundation in place, however, Phase 4 becomes the layer that kills sprawl before it even starts. The mandate here is straightforward and operational, beginning with the classification of every existing tenant as production, productivity, auxiliary, or ephemeral. As you document the business justification for each, you will likely find that 20% of your tenants are legacy or abandoned. These tenants represent technical debt and governance liability because they have no current business case and are not actively used. You must decommission them entirely rather than archiving them, because archival is just another form of debt while decommissioning is final. Second, you must implement strict creation policies so that new tenants can only be built with explicit approval and a documented business case. Do not allow ad hoc creation or let business units spin up environments without IT oversight. This approval process isn't just bureaucratic overhead, it is a vital architectural control. When a group requests a new tenant, they must justify the workload, explain why existing resources won't work, and define the expected lifespan. This forces intentional decision-making and stops accidental sprawl. Third, you must implement expiration policies where ephemeral tenants are decommissioned automatically by a timer that starts at creation. Auxiliary tenants should be reviewed every quarter, and if the business case has evaporated, the tenant must be removed. Only production tenants should be considered permanent, and this classification must be enforced by the system itself. The system knows which environments are temporary, it knows when they are set to expire, and it decommissions them without human intervention. Fourth, you must extend this lifecycle governance down to the level of teams, groups, and SharePoint sites. Default creation should be restricted so that governance is baked into the provisioning process from the very first second. When a user creates a team, the policy should automatically enforce naming conventions, visibility settings, and ownership requirements. When a site is created, it should be associated with a hub and classified by its specific purpose. Governance is not something you impose after the fact, it is something you enforce at the moment of creation. To track your progress, you should target a 100% classification rate for all tenants and a 0% rate for new shadow tenants. Your lifecycle compliance should stay above 95% to prove that sprawl is being prevented rather than just managed. These metrics will tell you exactly how much control you have regained over the ecosystem. The real-world impact of this phase is massive, as seen by a Fortune 500 company that discovered 2,000 inactive teams in their environment. By decommissioning those resources, they reduced their compliance audit scope by 40%, simply because those teams were no longer a liability. They moved from managing a chaotic mess to a smaller, active set of resources, which decreased the operational burden while improving their overall security posture. Phase 4 is about stopping the chaos before it has a chance to grow. Most organizations will find that huge portions of their ecosystem are legacy or abandoned, representing unnecessary risk and operational overhead. Decommissioning these resources reduces your burden, while creation and expiration policies ensure that temporary needs don't become permanent problems. Together, these practices create a tenant ecosystem that is actually managed. Do not skip this phase or assume that your teams and groups are all serving a valid purpose. Most organizations cannot answer basic questions about why their tenants exist, but Phase 4 forces those answers. It takes 90 days to complete and prepares you for Phase 5, where you will govern agents as first-class principals. The implementation mandate, Phase 5, agent governance, 360, 450 days. Phase 5 shifts the focus toward agent identity and agentic governance as you prepare the organization for the era of agent-scale operations. By now, you have already completed phases 1 through 4, meaning your identity layer is deterministic and your boundaries are strictly enforced. Your configuration lives under version control and your lifecycle is fully governed, so the next step is extending those same rigid principles to the autonomous entities operating within your tenant. Agents are not merely applications, they are principles that must be governed with the same level of scrutiny as any human user. This phase runs from day 360 to day 450 and builds directly upon the architectural foundation you established over the previous year. Attempting to govern agents without first controlling identity or enforcing boundaries is a recipe for immediate failure, as the effort becomes either meaningless or entirely unsustainable. When the foundation is solid, Phase 5 acts as the critical layer that prevents agent sprawl before it can take root in your environment. The mandate for this phase is both architectural and uncompromising, starting with the implementation of Agent 365 as your centralized agent registry. This is not optional infrastructure for any organization deploying AI at scale. It is the foundational source of truth for every agent that actually exists in your tenant. Instead of relying on what you think might be running, the registry ensures that every created agent is discoverable by IT and fully auditable. This registry serves as the baseline for all subsequent governance decisions, providing the visibility required to maintain control over the ecosystem. Your second task involves discovering every existing agent, including Copilot instances, Power Automate bots, and custom AI tools that often fly under the radar. Most organizations have no idea how many agents are currently operating because business teams frequently build and deploy them without ever notifying IT. It is common for an audit to uncover hundreds of unsanctioned agents 6 months after the fact, but Agent 365 makes this discovery process automatic. By cataloging every agent, you finally understand what exists, who owns the logic, and exactly what data the entity is accessing. Third, you must register every discovered agent in that centralized registry and assign each one a unique intra-agent ID. Every agent requires a human sponsor who is held personally accountable for the agent's behavior, rather than shifting that responsibility to a faceless development team. This creates a clear line of ownership so that when an agent misbehaves or needs to be decommissioned, the point of contact is already established. Sponsorship is not a piece of bureaucratic overhead. It is a form of architectural accountability that ensures someone is always watching the machine. Fourth, you must implement scoped permissions to ensure no agent possesses broad, unrestricted access to your environment. Every agent should operate within tightly defined data and action boundaries, such as a Copilot instance that can read emails to summarize them, but lacks the permission to delete or send them. A Power Automate agent designed to create tasks should be able to write to Planner without having the authority to modify or wipe out existing entries. This is not about restriction for the sake of it, but rather about building a trustworthy architecture where agents can operate without constant human oversight. Fifth, you must set up continuous agent monitoring to log every action and alert your team the moment anomalous behavior is detected. Rather than waiting for a quarterly audit to find a problem, you should establish playbooks that allow for the immediate suspension of any agent acting outside its scope. When the system detects a deviation, the agent is suspended by policy through an automated trigger, rather than a slow manual process. This ensures the system remains deterministic, enforcing your security assumptions at scale without requiring a human to click a button. Success in Phase 5 is measured by specific, uncompromising targets that reflect the health of your agent ecosystem. You are aiming for 100% of agents to be in the centralized registry, 100% to have human sponsors, and 100% of all agent actions to be logged and auditable. These metrics are the only way to determine if your AI environment is truly sovereign or if it has become an accidental collection of unmanaged risks. A real-world scenario from a financial services firm validates why this level of control is necessary for modern enterprises. During their Phase 5 discovery, they found 300 unmanaged Copilot instances accessing sensitive data, but they managed to reduce that number to 12 sanctioned, scoped instances within 90 days. The organization did not lose any actual capability during this consolidation. Instead, they gained the visibility they had been missing. Those 12 instances were far more powerful than the original 300 because they were monitored, scoped, and aligned with a specific business purpose. Phase 5 is ultimately about treating agents as first-class principles within your architectural model. You aren't trying to solve every possible AI problem at once, but you are solving the most critical issues of visibility and control. Once every agent is registered, sponsored, and scoped, your entire agent ecosystem becomes deterministic and predictable. Do not skip this 90-day phase, as it delivers the measurable value required to move into Phase 6, where your operations themselves become deterministic. The implementation mandate. Phase 6, deterministic operations, 455, 40 days. Phase 6 focuses on deterministic operations and the transition to a zero-fault maintenance model where you finally shift from being reactive to being proactive. You have already spent 450 days hardening your identity layer, enforcing boundaries, and governing the lifecycle of both users and agents. Now you must ensure that the way you manage the system is just as predictable as the system itself. This phase is about moving away from the chaos of incident management and toward a model of total incident prevention. This phase runs from day 450 to day 540 and relies entirely on the architectural work completed in the previous 5 stages. If you attempt to run deterministic operations without identity control or configuration management, you aren't actually running operations. You are just relying on hope. When the foundation is solid, phase 6 becomes the layer that makes the entire environment resilient to change and external pressure. The mandate here is both cultural and technical, starting with the establishment of a rigorous quality culture across the entire organization. This isn't a reflection of individual skill, but rather a system of organizational accountability, where every single component has a clearly defined owner. The owner isn't just there to fix things when they break. They are responsible for ensuring the component never breaks in the first place. By assigning accountability for drift and remediation, you ensure that when a configuration changes, someone is responsible for catching it and correcting it immediately. Second, you must design for high availability by defining specific SLO, RTO, and RPO targets for every critical service in your tenant. You cannot achieve high availability by wishing for it, so you must build it into the architecture through redundancy and automated failover. A service that requires 99.9% uptime needs to be tested constantly, which means running failover simulations every quarter to ensure the recovery plan actually works. You should never wait for a real-world disaster to discover that your failover process is flawed or that your team doesn't know how to execute it. Third, you need to implement dynamic risk governance to account for the fact that change in a cloud environment is continuous. You should maintain a comprehensive fault library that documents every known issue along with its corresponding remediation playbook. These playbooks must be updated quarterly, adding new fault patterns as they emerge and removing old ones that are no longer relevant to your stack. By running regular drills and validating your procedures, you ensure that when an incident does occur, your team executes a tested script instead of improvising under pressure. Fourth, you must deploy intelligent O&M tools that use automation to detect faults and remediate known patterns without human intervention. Automated health checks should run continuously rather than on a fixed schedule, allowing the monitoring system to catch threshold breaches the moment they happen. Low-risk fixes should trigger automated remediation playbooks immediately, while high-risk changes are held at a gate for manual approval. This approach makes escalation a rare event because most faults follow predictable patterns that the system is already programmed to handle. The results of this shift are measurable and significant for any enterprise that values stability. Organizations that implement deterministic operations typically see a 40% reduction in their mean time to resolution and a 60% drop in manual effort. These gains don't happen because the staff suddenly became more talented. They happen because the system no longer requires human brilliance to stay online. The system is deterministic, which means the response to any failure is predictable and the outcome is always consistent. To get started, you must define ownership for every architectural layer and assign clear accountability for incidents and configuration drift. Once you have established your SLOs and RTO targets, you can begin the quarterly failover testing that proves your architecture is resilient. Maintaining that fault library is essential, as it turns every past mistake into a documented playbook that prevents future downtime. When your health checks run continuously and your playbooks trigger automatically, the need for manual escalation begins to disappear. You must measure the metrics that actually indicate operational health, such as a target of under 5 minutes for fault detection. Your goal for remediation should be under 10 minutes. With at least 80% of all faults resolved without ever needing to escalate to a senior engineer. These numbers will tell you whether your operations have become truly deterministic or if you are still stuck in a reactive or firefighting mode. Phase 6 is about making the management of your environment as predictable as the code that runs it. You aren't solving every operational headache, but you are solving the most critical one, the time it takes to respond to an incident. Once detection and remediation happen in minutes through automation, your operations become a deterministic engine. This 90-day phase is a mandatory prerequisite for Phase 7, where you will finally measure and improve your total sovereignty. The implementation mandate. Phase 7, continuous sovereignty assessment, 540-630 days. Phase 7 focuses on continuous sovereignty assessment and architectural oversight, marking the final stage of the mandate. This is not the end of the process, it is the beginning of the practice. You have already completed phases 1 through 6, which means your identity layer is deterministic and your boundaries are strictly enforced. Your configuration lives under version control, your lifecycle is governed, and your agents are scoped and monitored. Now you must measure whether any of this is actually working. You have to make sovereignty visible and hold the system accountable. This phase runs from day 540 to day 630, building directly on the foundation you established over the previous year and a half. If you attempt phase 7 without that foundation, you will end up measuring nothing but noise. When the foundation is solid, phase 7 becomes the layer that makes every previous decision and configuration accountable to the organization. The mandate here is straightforward and strategic. You must implement a sovereignty audit framework. This involves establishing a dashboard that measures governance health across all 6 previous layers. This is not a compliance checklist designed to satisfy an auditor. It is an architecture health dashboard that tells you whether your tenant remains sovereign or if entropy is starting to accumulate in the corners. The sovereignty scorecard measures 6 specific dimensions. First, we look at identity governance. You need to know what percentage of privileged roles are under PM enforcement, and the target is 100%. You must track what percentage of accounts are governed by conditional access policies, aiming for 100%, while keeping your external identity exposure index under 5%. Second, we measure boundary enforcement. Every cross-tenant connection must be explicitly allowed, and every data flow must be auditable. Your goal is a breach containment time of under 4 hours. Third, we assess configuration determinism. Every policy should be under version control, allowing you to detect drift in under 5 minutes and remediate deviations in under 10. Fourth, we look at lifecycle governance. All tenants must be classified and your shadow tenant discovery rate should be 0. Fifth, we evaluate agent governance. Every agent must exist in a centralized registry with a human sponsor, and every action they take must be logged. Finally, we measure operational excellence. You are looking for a mean time to detect faults of under 5 minutes, with 80% of those faults resolved without needing an escalation. These are not vanity metrics used to look good in a report. They measure how much of your governance depends on human memory versus architectural enforcement. Sovereignty is measurable by how little it relies on people remembering to do the right thing. You must establish quarterly sovereignty reviews where executive leadership reviews the dashboard to identify gaps and prioritize improvements. This is not a technical deep dive, it is a strategic review. The sovereignty scorecard should be treated as a board-level metric rather than a technical artifact. It is a strategic measure of whether your organization is running Microsoft 365 or being run by it. Implement continuous improvement cycles to keep the system sharp. Every quarter, you should identify the lowest scoring layer and improve it by 10% through systematic changes rather than heroic individual effort. Where data is available, establish external benchmarking to compare your sovereignty scores against industry peers. This allows you to identify improvement opportunities based on actual comparative analysis. Organizations that implement continuous sovereignty assessment usually see a 25% improvement in governance maturity within the first 6 months. This doesn't happen because they are trying harder. It happens because they made governance visible. What gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed eventually improves. Phase 7 is about institutionalizing sovereignty, so it becomes a continuous practice rather than a one-time project. Once you can measure whether your tenant is sovereign, you can finally make informed decisions about how to improve it. Without measurement, you are operating blind and simply hoping your governance is working. You do not actually know. Do not skip this phase. It takes 90 days to complete the mandate and establish the practice that will sustain your sovereignty over time. Without phase 7, the previous 6 phases will eventually drift into chaos. With it, your sovereignty is no longer just a collection of settings. It is a measured, managed system that improves continuously because you can finally see the gears turning. Scenario 1, cross-tenant chaos and power platform data leakage. Now that we have outlined the 7-step mandate and the phased approach, let's examine 2 critical scenarios that test your sovereignty. These scenarios illustrate exactly what happens when sovereignty fails and how an organization can recover. The first scenario involves cross-tenant chaos and power platform data leakage. This is not a theoretical exercise. This is happening in large organizations right now. And while many haven't felt the consequences yet, they eventually will. Consider an organization with 15 Microsoft 365 tenants and unrestricted Power Platform connectors. Because there are no explicit allow lists or tenant isolation policies, business teams have built 200 automation flows that move data across tenants without any documented justification. These flows were created over several years, leaving some active, some dormant, and many completely forgotten. No one knows how many exist, what data they move, or where that data eventually ends up. The risk exposure here is severe. Data moves across boundaries without an audit trail, and external identities often have overprivileged access to move that data. Because conditional access policies are inconsistent across the 15 tenants, no one can answer basic security questions. A compliance officer cannot say where data goes when it leaves the tenant, and a security officer cannot determine which other tenants are at risk if one is breached. An architect cannot even predict what would happen if they tried to enforce isolation. Then on February 1st, 2026, Microsoft enforces Power Platform tenant isolation by default. All cross-tenant connections are blocked unless they are explicitly configured. 150 of those 200 flows break overnight, causing business teams to panic as projects stall and users report constant errors. It is forced to scramble to restore access without understanding what they are actually turning back on. The organization faces a clear choice. They can disable tenant isolation entirely to stop the bleeding, or they can implement the recovery mandate. The recovery mandate requires a full audit of all cross-tenant connections to document a business justification for each one. You must implement explicit allow lists so only justified flows can run. You then apply conditional access and DLP policies consistently across every tenant to prevent unauthorized movement. During the audit step, the organization might discover that only 35 of those 200 flows actually have a documented business need. The other 165 are legacy or duplicative, and decommissioning them reduces cross-tenant data movement by 82% immediately. Next come the allow lists. The organization configures explicit entries for those 35 justified flows, specifying the source, the target, and the reason for the connection. These lists are reviewed every quarter, and if a justification expires, the flow is shut down. The third step addresses the inconsistency of conditional access. The organization finds that while one tenant requires MFA, another does not, and while one blocks legacy auth, another leaves the door wide open. They solve this by implementing a consistent baseline where every tenant requires MFA and enforces device compliance for privileged roles. Finally, they implement DLP policies to protect sensitive data classes like PII and financial records. When these data classes attempt to cross a tenant boundary, the system detects the movement and either blocks or warns the user depending on the policy. Every event is logged for review. The outcome of this process is measurable. Within 90 days, the organization can reduce cross-tenant flows from 200 down to 35, all with documented trails. Data leakage risk drops by 85%, and the organization regains sovereignty over its data. There is a deeper lesson in this failure. The organization did not fail because they lacked the right technology, as Microsoft 365 has always had the capability to enforce this isolation. They failed because they did not treat boundary enforcement as an architectural requirement. They treated it as an optional feature and viewed cross-tenant flows as a matter of convenience rather than a matter of risk. Sovereignty requires a fundamental shift in your mental model. Data movement is not a convenience, it is a risk. Cross-tenant flows are not optional shortcuts. They are architectural decisions that must be justified and audited. Tenant isolation is not a restriction, it is architecture. This scenario illustrates the external risks of a failed mandate. The next scenario will illustrate the internal entropy that occurs when governance is ignored. Scenario 2, configuration drift and M365 DSC enforcement. The second scenario illustrates what happens when configuration is not deterministic, and this is not a theoretical exercise. This is the reality for most organizations right now. The situation is a familiar one. An organization configured their security baseline 18 months ago, but since then, exceptions have quietly accumulated. Global admin roles were assigned to 15 additional users temporarily, while conditional access policies were disabled for 3 departments under the same temporary pretense. DLP policies have been modified 40 times, leaving 12 exceptions active that no one remembers granting or justifying. The organization lacks version control and an audit trail, which means they have no way to know what their actual security baseline even looks like anymore. The result is severe risk exposure because the security baseline has drifted significantly from its original intent. No one knows which exceptions are still justified or when they were supposed to expire, and manual audits only discover this drift by accident. When compliance auditors eventually come calling, the organization finds itself unable to explain why their actual security posture bears no resemblance to their documented baseline. This leads to the inevitable audit failure. When the auditor asks to see the security baseline, the organization produces a document from 18 months ago and claims it represents their current state. The auditor then tests the configuration and discovers that the reality is dramatically different, with overprivileged global admins and disabled conditional access policies. Because DLP exceptions have become permanent fixtures rather than temporary fixes, the organization is now out of compliance with its own internal standards. Remediation is the next hurdle, but because the process is manual, it becomes an operational nightmare. An administrator must identify every single deviation and track down the business justification for each one before deciding whether to revert the change or update the baseline. This manual cycle of testing and deploying changes takes weeks to complete, and because it is so error-prone, it often introduces new drift while the old drift is being fixed. The recovery mandate requires a shift in architecture. Establish a baseline configuration as code. You must document every setting, policy, and exception within a system that runs reconciliation checks every 4 hours. By moving to a model where every configuration change is version controlled and approved, you can automate remediation for known deviations and make manual intervention a rare event. The first step in this process is baseline establishment using Microsoft 365 Desired State Configuration, or M365 DSC. By codifying the baseline, every setting and policy is version controlled, and every exception is tied to a specific reason and expiration date. The baseline is no longer a static ignored document. It is the living code that defines the environment. The second step focuses on drift detection through a system that continuously compares the actual configuration to the desired state. Every 4 hours, the system runs a reconciliation check to ensure the environment hasn't moved. When the actual configuration deviates from the code, an alert fires immediately, meaning drift is detected in minutes rather than discovered months later during a quarterly audit. The third step is change approval, where administrators no longer modify the configuration directly. Instead, they propose a change to the baseline code, which is then submitted for a formal review to ensure the why and what are fully understood. If the reviewer approves the change, it is tested in a non-production environment and then deployed, creating a fully auditable trail. 6 months later, if someone asks why a policy exists, the organization can simply read the change request to see who proposed it, who approved it, and exactly when it went live. The fourth step is automated remediation, which ensures the system doesn't just alert and wait for a human to log in. For low-risk deviations, the system applies the fix automatically, while high-risk changes might require a human to click an approval gate. This turns the remediation loop into a process measured in minutes rather than weeks of manual labor. The outcome of this architectural shift is measurable and immediate. Within 90 days, the organization can eliminate all unjustified exceptions and return to a deterministic configuration where drift is caught within 5 minutes. By automating remediation, the organization regains sovereignty over its own configuration. But there is a deeper lesson here. Configuration is not a one-time event, but a continuous practice. Organizations that treat their settings as static will inevitably accumulate entropy and security debt. Those that treat configuration as code achieve sovereignty. And the difference between the two isn't about effort, it's about architecture. Measuring sovereignty, the metrics that matter. Sovereignty is measurable, and you cannot improve a system that you do not measure. This principle is foundational to real governance, yet many organizations claim to have control while possessing no metrics or dashboards to prove it. They have no way to know whether their governance is actually working or if it is merely existing as a collection of ignored policies. The sovereignty scorecard uses 6 operational dimensions to tell you whether your tenant is sovereign or accidental. The first dimension is identity governance, where 3 specific metrics define your success. You should target 100% for privileged roles under PM enforcement, because if you have standing privileges, you don't have governance, you have identity hope. PM ensures that every elevated access is time-bound, requested, and logged, which is an architectural requirement rather than a simple restriction. You must also target 100% for accounts under conditional access, ensuring every single identity is subject to policy-driven decisions. Finally, your external identity exposure index should stay under 5%, because if your guest and vendor accounts have broad access, your boundary enforcement has failed. The second dimension is boundary enforcement, which starts with ensuring 100% of cross-tenant connections are explicitly allowed. Every connection must be documented and authorized, rather than left to implicit defaults. You also need to ensure that 100% of data flows are auditable, meaning the system records the source, destination, and classification of every movement. The final metric here is breach containment time, which must be under 4 hours. If you cannot isolate a breached tenant and prevent it from spreading to others within that window, your boundaries are not deterministic. The third dimension is configuration determinism, and it requires that 100% of your policies are under version control. Every policy should exist as code so that it remains auditable and protected from unauthorized changes. Your mean time to detect drift should be under 5 minutes, with the system continuously watching for deviations from the baseline. Once drift is detected, your mean time to remediate should be under 10 minutes, moving the process away from manual troubleshooting and into automated recovery. The fourth dimension is lifecycle governance, where you must ensure that 100% of your tenants are classified with a clear purpose and owner. If you are discovering new shadow tenants every quarter, your creation controls are weak and your shadow tenant discovery rate should be 0. You should also target a 95% lifecycle compliance rate, ensuring that temporary resources actually expire on schedule. If resources are allowed to linger indefinitely, your governance is nothing more than theater. The fifth dimension is agent governance, which is critical for managing the risks of shadow AI. 100% of your agents must be in a centralized registry, because an unmanaged agent is an unmanaged risk. Every agent also requires a human sponsor who is responsible for its behavior, and this sponsor should be a specific individual rather than a generic business unit. Finally, 100% of agent actions must be logged and auditable so that every move the AI makes is traceable to a specific actor. The sixth dimension is operational excellence, focusing on how quickly the system responds to failure. Your mean time to detect faults should be under 5 minutes, and your mean time to remediate those faults should be under 10 minutes using automated playbooks. You should also aim to resolve 80% of faults without escalation, as most issues follow known patterns that automation can handle. If your team is constantly escalating basic issues, you haven't yet achieved operational maturity. These are not vanity metrics, they measure how much of your governance relies on human memory versus architectural enforcement. Sovereignty is defined by how little you depend on people remembering to do the right thing. When you can answer for all 6 dimensions with confidence, your tenant is sovereign, but when you cannot, your tenant is accidental. The metrics will tell you which one you have. Sustaining sovereignty, the governance mandate. Sovereignty is not a destination you reach and then abandon, but rather a continuous practice that requires constant attention. Without a commitment to ongoing governance, entropy will inevitably accumulate within your environment. You might complete all 7 phases and achieve a state of sovereignty, yet without intentional effort, the system will immediately begin to drift. New business units will demand exceptions to your standards, new projects will spawn unmanaged resources, and new technologies will introduce layers of complexity you didn't plan for. Drift is not a sign of failure, but rather the natural state of any complex system that lacks a continuous governance model to hold it in place. The mandate for sustaining this state is both clear and strictly operational. You must establish a sovereignty council, which functions as a cross-functional team, including members from IT, security, architecture, and the broader business. This council needs to meet quarterly to review your sovereignty scorecard, rather than waiting for an annual audit or a compliance deadline to force their hand. During these sessions, the council evaluates the 6 core dimensions: identity governance, boundary enforcement, configuration determinism, lifecycle governance, agent governance, and operational excellence. For every single dimension, the leadership must ask if the system is improving, remaining stable, or actively degrading. If a specific area is degrading, you must identify the cause and determine exactly what corrective action is required to restore the architectural intent. Establishing improvement cycles ensures that progress remains a constant feature of your operations. Every quarter, your team should identify the lowest scoring dimension on the scorecard and commit to improving it by at least 10%. This isn't about heroic individual efforts or late-night troubleshooting, but rather about implementing systematic improvements that stick. If your identity governance currently sits at 90%, your goal is to move that needle to 99% through better automation and policy enforcement. Continuous improvement is not a quest for abstract perfection, but a practical strategy for preventing the degradation of the hard work you have already put into the system. You must also establish strict change governance where every configuration adjustment follows a formal approval process. Every exception to your established rules must be treated as a temporary state that is tracked and eventually retired. When a department requests an exception, that request goes directly to the Sovereignty Council for a formal review and a final decision. If the Council approves the request, the exception is granted with a hard expiration date instead of being allowed to exist indefinitely. When that date arrives, the exception expires automatically, forcing the requester to justify the need all over again if they want to renew it. This mechanism prevents temporary workarounds from becoming permanent fixtures of your technical debt. A sovereign organization must also commit to continuous learning by documenting every incident that occurs within the tenant. You need to understand exactly why a failure happened, update your playbooks to reflect that reality, and share that knowledge across the entire organization. Do not treat security incidents or system failures as random anomalies, but instead treat them as valuable data points that reveal the truth about your environment. Incidents tell you exactly where your architecture is weak and where your human processes are insufficient, allowing you to improve specifically because of those failures. External accountability is the final piece of the puzzle, requiring you to report your sovereignty scorecard to the board of directors every quarter. You must present this as a strategic metric rather than a minor operational detail, because what gets reported to the board is what ultimately gets the attention of leadership. When the board sees that identity governance is degrading, they will ask difficult questions, and when they see that agent governance is weak, they will demand a plan for improvement. This level of external pressure drives internal discipline, ensuring that the resources needed for a sovereign environment are always available. Organizations that successfully sustain sovereignty see measurable outcomes that justify the effort. Their incident volume decreases year over year, their governance maturity improves without backsliding, and executive confidence in the technology platform grows. Operational costs also tend to decrease as automation replaces manual intervention, which is a direct consequence of systematic governance rather than a lucky coincidence. The alternative is the reactive model that most organizations currently follow. In that world, governance is only tightened after a major breach occurs, and as soon as the crisis passes, the discipline is relaxed once again. Their metrics are nothing more than vanity numbers, and entropy continues to build until the next major incident forces another round of expensive remediation. This cycle of crisis and relaxation means the organization is always in recovery mode and never achieves true stability. Sustaining sovereignty requires the discipline to maintain quarterly reviews, improvement cycles, and strict change governance. These are not optional suggestions, but the specific practices that separate organizations that run Microsoft 365 from those that are being run by it. The mandate is architectural, not tactical. The sovereign tenant is not a simple checklist or a project plan you can finish and file away. It is a mental operating system for how you manage the most critical parts of your digital infrastructure. This framework represents the fundamental difference between running Microsoft 365 and being controlled by the platform's inherent complexity. It is the difference between having proactive governance and being governed by the slow creep of entropy. Ultimately, it is the difference between treating your tenant as a simple container for configurations and treating it as a sovereign operating system designed for the enterprise. The 7 layers of identity, boundaries, configuration, lifecycle, agents, operations, and assessment are not independent silos. They are deeply interdependent parts of a single machine. Identity without boundaries is incomplete, and boundaries without configuration management will always be unstable. Configuration that lacks lifecycle governance will eventually sprawl out of control, while lifecycle management without agent governance will be constantly disrupted. Agents operating without deterministic processes will cause failures to cascade, and operations that aren't measured will inevitably degrade over time. Implementing these layers in the correct sequence creates a deterministic system that is predictable, auditable, and resilient against change. This is the architectural mandate for 2026 and the years that follow. Your organization will either choose to adopt this model, or it will eventually be adopted by the chaos of the platform itself.